Maria always believed her older brother Daniel was the one solid thing in her life. The steady voice, the protector, the person who stepped in whenever their world got messy. But on the Dr. Phil stage, under those bright, unforgiving lights, one sheet of paper shattered that entire story. A DNA report, thin as a grocery receipt, holding a truth their mother took to her grave. When Dr. Phil read the final line, he didn't interrupt, he didn't question, he just went silent. And the look on Daniel's face told Maria that silence was more terrifying than any answer she imagined. Because the truth wasn't just unexpected, it rewrote her entire identity. What happened next didn't just expose a family secret. It forced Maria to face a question no one is ready for. What if the person you trusted most was the one truth you never really knew? The studio lights weren't just bright tonight. They felt intrusive, almost harsh, like they were slicing through every layer Maria had tried to protect. She sat stiffly in her chair, fingers tangled together, knuckles white. Across from her, Daniel couldn't stop fidgeting. He kept rubbing his palms on his jeans, swallowing hard, glancing everywhere except at her. For a sibling who had always stood tall, always looked calm, he suddenly looked like a man made of paper. Dr. Phil leaned forward with that quiet seriousness he uses when the room is about to change. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't build suspense. He just placed the DNA report on the small table between them, deliberately, gently, and said, "Maria, what do you think this means?" A simple question, but it landed like a bomb. Maria's breath shook. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then tried to steady her voice. "I don't know anymore," she said. "I thought I knew who I was. I thought I knew who he was." She cut her eyes toward Daniel, just for a second, like looking hurt. Daniel dropped his gaze to the floor. He looked almost ashamed. The audience felt it. You could hear a pin drop. Even the cameras seemed to hum quieter, like they understood something fragile was happening. "Maria, tried again. You were supposed to protect me," she whispered. Not angry, not accusing, just broken. "You were supposed to tell me the truth." Daniel finally lifted his eyes. They were glassy, red at the edges. "I tried," he said, voice trembling. "You don't understand. I tried to protect you from the truth." That sentence froze the air. Dr. Phil narrowed his eyes slightly, not in judgment, but in recognition. He'd heard this tone before. People drowning in secrets. People who carried truths so heavy they warped everything around them. He asked the question no one wanted to hear. "Then why did your mother hide this?" Daniel shut his eyes, tight like the question physically hurt. Maria's lips parted. She hadn't expected him to react like that. It wasn't the reaction of someone caught. It was the reaction of someone cornered by a memory too heavy to speak. Maria leaned forward. "Daniel, what are you not telling me?" The room swelled with tension again. Every viewer could feel it. Something important was on the tip of his tongue. Something that didn't match the simple explanation Maria had feared. Something older, darker. Daniel opened his eyes slowly. "There's something you need to know," he said, voice low, cracking under the weight of whatever he'd carried for years. "But not here." Maria's face tensed. Confusion, fear, betrayal. A lifetime of trust shaking in real time. If not here, then where? And more importantly, why not here? The camera pushed in. The silence stretched. Because the truth wasn't ready to come out. Not yet, but it was coming. And it would change everything about who Maria thought she was. 3 months before the studio lights, before the report, before Daniel's voice cracked under a secret he'd carried half his life, Maria's world was normal. Predictable. Quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you think nothing hidden could ever survive in it. She worked mornings at a small bakery on Lafayette Street. She called her brother every Sunday. She visited her mother's grave every Christmas. Her life was simple, almost scripted, and she liked it that way. Because when you grow up in a house full of whispers, silence feels like safety. But that silence didn't last. It started with a phone call. Maria was washing dishes after dinner, the faucet running and steam fogging the window when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost ignored it, until a voice she faintly recognized said, "Maria, this is your Aunt Evelyn, her mother's estranged sister." someone who hadn't contacted their family in nearly 2 decades. Maria wiped her hands on a towel. "Aunt Evelyn, is everything okay?" There was a pause. A long one. Too long. The final reveal arrived when Dr. Phil returned one last time, holding a sheet of paper summarizing the verified evidence. The audience leaned in. Linda braced herself, and he said something none of them expected. "The recording is real, but the story behind it is not what either of you think." The studio froze. Linda looked up sharply. Mark stopped breathing. Even the cameras seemed to hover. Because the truth wasn't just about who he talked to. It was about why the woman reached out, and what she wanted in return. Dr. Phil paused, letting the gravity settle, then prepared to deliver what would become the turning point of the entire episode, the moment that would decide whether this marriage fell apart or began the long road to repair. When the truth finally comes out, is it meant to destroy or to rebuild? Some truths break us. Others rebuild us in ways we never expected. What happened on that stage wasn't just a marriage crisis. It was a reminder that secrets grow in silence. But healing begins the moment someone speaks up. If this story moved you, share your thoughts or a moment when honesty changed your life. Your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Possible relationship, parent/child, or full sibling. Unusually high for standard siblings. No, that couldn't be right. That couldn't make sense. She and Daniel were 5 years apart. Their mother always introduced them as siblings. Nothing in her life, not 1 second, had hinted at anything different. Except maybe it had. The missing certificate, the strange photo, Daniel's protectiveness that sometimes felt like more than a brother's concern. Her mother's panic whenever someone mentioned family history. Maria's hands shook as she reread the result over and over, each time hoping it would change. It didn't. That night, she texted Daniel. "Can we talk? Just us." He didn't answer. She called, straight to voicemail. By morning, he still hadn't responded. And by Sunday, he was gone. Maria drove to his apartment. His car wasn't there. His lights were off. His neighbor said he'd left abruptly, carrying 2 duffel bags, looking pale and distressed. Something was wrong. Deeply, dangerously wrong. 3 days passed with no word. Then, on a Wednesday evening, Maria returned home to something she hadn't seen in years. A torn, yellowed envelope with her name on it. No stamp, no return address. Just her name written in her mother's handwriting. Her chest tightened so fast she had to sit down. Inside was a letter. Old, fragile, creased from being opened many times. Maybe by her mother, maybe by someone else. Maybe someone who never found the courage to give it to her. The letter didn't say everything, but it said enough to terrify her. "My darling Maria, if you are reading this, it means the truth has found you. I pray it does not destroy what I tried so hard to protect." The rest of the letter was smudged, water-damaged. Some sentences were impossible to read, but one line stood out clear as day, untouched by time. "Forgive Daniel. What he did out of love." Maria pressed the letter to her chest. Tears welled up and spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. Love? What kind of love looked like this? What kind of love required lies so big they swallowed an entire childhood? She couldn't answer those questions alone. She needed help. She needed clarity. She needed truth spoken out loud. So she made a choice. She contacted the Dr. Phil show. This wasn't about exposing anyone. This wasn't about drama. This was about survival, about sanity, about understanding why her entire identity suddenly felt like it had been built on sand. When the producers called back, they asked her one question: "Is Daniel willing to come?" Maria stared at the DNA report, at her mother's trembling handwriting, at the empty seat across her table. "I don't know," she said softly. "But he has to." She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. It wasn't the DNA that scared her anymore. It was Daniel's reaction, and that fear would drag her straight onto the stage where her entire life would finally be confronted. Backstage at the Dr. Phil studio didn't feel like a waiting room that day. It felt like a confession chamber. The walls were lined with soft lights and quiet voices, but Daniel sat in the far corner, head down, hands clasped tight, like he was holding onto something that might slip away if he loosened his grip. He looked nothing like the brother Maria knew. He didn't have that steady posture, that protective aura, that familiar half-smile. He looked like someone who had finally run out of places to hide. A producer approached him gently, the way someone approaches a man standing too close to a cliff. "Daniel," she said softly, "we just want to make sure you're okay before the taping." He nodded, but didn't lift his eyes. "I'm fine," he whispered, though every inch of him trembled with the weight of a truth he'd been holding for over 25 years. The producer sat across from him, leaning in just enough to show she was present, not prying. "Your sister told us you've been hard to reach. She's worried about you." For the first time in several minutes, Daniel exhaled, slow, shaky like it hurt. "I wasn't hiding from her," he said. I was trying to figure out how to say something I promised I never would." The producer nodded, letting silence give him permission to continue. Daniel rubbed his forehead with the heel of his hand. "I was 15 when it happened," he said. "Mom came home one night holding a baby. Holding her. And she looked. I'll never forget it. She looked like she'd just lived a nightmare she couldn't wake up from." He swallowed hard, his voice tightening. She was bruised, shirt torn, barely able to stand. His jaw clenched, as though the memory itself burned. She didn't speak for hours. She just rocked the baby, rocked her like she was trying to erase something she couldn't say out loud. The producer's eyes softened. "Did she tell you what happened?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Eventually, but not everything. Just enough to make me understand that Maria wasn't safe. Not from the man who—" He stopped, looked away, and wiped his eyes quickly with the back of his hand. "From the man who hurt her. The man she was terrified would come looking." A long, heavy silence filled the room. "And she told me," he continued, voice breaking, "that if anyone ever asked about the baby, I was to say I was her older brother. She made me rehearse it, over and over. You're 15. She's your baby sister. You love her. That's all anyone needs to know." He looked up for a moment, guilt darkening his expression. "I didn't want to lie, but she begged, and I couldn't watch her fall apart." The producer leaned forward. "So you kept the secret?" Daniel laughed softly, a sad, hollow sound. "I didn't just keep it. I breathed it. I lived it. It became who I was. And the older Maria got, the more the story felt real. I forgot where the lie ended and where the truth began." "But that wasn't the whole story, was it?" the producer asked gently. Daniel's breath caught. He closed his eyes, as if bracing for impact. "No," he whispered. "There's more." He hesitated. The kind of hesitation that comes before a truth so painful it's easier to bury than speak. The producer didn't rush him. She simply let the silence make space. Finally, Daniel opened his eyes again. And this time, there were tears he didn't try to hide. "She thinks I'm her brother," he said, voice cracking. "But the truth is, I didn't just raise her like a sister. I raised her like—" He cut himself off, shaking his head, unable to finish the sentence. "Mom made choices because she was scared. But I made choices because I didn't know what else to do." "Daniel," the producer said softly, "Maria deserves to hear this from you." He nodded, but his jaw tightened. "I know, but not out there. Not on that stage. Not with her looking at me like I'm a stranger." The producer took a breath. "Then tell me one thing. Just one. Who was Maria's biological father?" The question landed like a hammer. Daniel looked up, eyes wet, voice barely audible. "It wasn't a stranger. It was someone Mom spent her whole life trying to escape." He leaned in, whispered a single name. The producer's face went pale, and the camera cut right there, because some truths are too heavy to hear until the moment they're meant to break open. When Daniel walked onto the stage, the air changed. Even the audience could feel it, something heavier than guilt, deeper than fear, something that had lived inside him for far too long. Maria watched him with a kind of cautious hope, like she wanted to believe he'd finally tell her the truth, but was terrified to hear it. Dr. Phil glanced at both of them before picking up the old, yellowed letter Maria had brought. He held it carefully, the way you'd hold something fragile, because he understood something that Maria hadn't realized yet. This wasn't just a family secret. This was a lifeline someone had dropped decades ago. He unfolded the letter and began reading, his voice steady but low. "My darling Maria, if you are reading this, I know the truth has reached you. I hope you understand that everything I did was to protect you." Maria swallowed. Daniel didn't move. Dr. Phil continued. "You were born from a moment of violence, a moment I never recovered from. And the man responsible, he wasn't a stranger. He was someone close, someone we couldn't escape." Gasps rippled across the audience. Maria covered her mouth. Her eyes glistened. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." Dr. Phil looked at Daniel. "Your mother says she begged you to protect your sister, even if that meant hiding the truth from her." Daniel's face crumpled. He didn't wipe the tears this time. He let them fall. "I was a kid," he said, voice breaking. "I didn't know what to do. She came home with a baby and bruises. She told me that man, the man who hurt her, would come looking if he ever found out she kept the baby. And I promised her. I promised I'd be your brother, not your father, because the truth would put you in danger." The studio froze. Maria's breath caught in her throat. She stared at him, stunned, shaking her head in disbelief, but not out of anger. Out of heartbreak. Out of the sudden, overwhelming realization that the person she trusted most had been carrying a burden large enough to crush anyone. "You were 15, she whispered. "Daniel, you were just a kid." He nodded. "But I raised you. I loved you. I changed your diapers, packed your lunches, held you when you cried. I didn't feel like a father. I felt like your protector. And somewhere along the way, I forgot how to tell you the truth without losing you." Dr. Phil leaned forward, his tone softer than usual, gentle, almost fatherly. "Secrets like this aren't about lies. They're about survival. Your mother made choices out of fear. Daniel made choices out of love. And now the two of you have to decide how you move forward, with honesty, compassion, and maybe forgiveness." Maria wiped her tears. Slowly, she reached out her hand toward Daniel. It trembled, but it reached. He took it instantly. And for the first time in days, maybe years, Maria didn't look confused. She looked relieved, not because the truth was easy, but because finally, it was hers. Dr. Phil nodded quietly. "Maybe this truth didn't break your family," he said. "Maybe it finally freed it. If this story touched something in you, if it made you think about the power of truth or the weight of secrets families carry in silence, you're not alone." Stories like Maria and Daniel's remind us that healing doesn't start with answers. It starts with honesty, courage, and the willingness to face what hurts. If you've lived through something similar, or if you just want to share your thoughts, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And if you'd like more real stories that explore family, forgiveness, and the strength it takes to rebuild, consider subscribing. Your voice matters here. Your story matters too.